Welcome everyone to our panel, Policing Black and Brown Communities in New York City, Reckoning with the Past and Envisioning a Better Future. I'm Terry Rosenblatt and I chair the City Bar's Criminal Courts Committee. On behalf of our committee and co-sponsoring committee, Criminal Justice Operations Chair Tess Cohen, thank you so much for being here. And a very warm welcome to our distinguished panelists and moderator. Honestly, I can't imagine a better and more interesting and informed group of people to talk about this issue. So we're so pleased that you're here. A few housekeeping things before I turn it over. This panel is going to be a combination of short presentations and a discussion led by our moderator, Graeme Raymond of the New York Daily News. There's going to be time for audience Q&A, so please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You'll see that there's only one box, there's no chat. So just put everything in the Q&A and then you'll be called on at the end. The panel is being recorded. And with that, I will introduce our City Bar President, the amazing Sheila S. Boston, who's going to deliver some opening remarks. Sheila is the 69th president of the New York City Bar Association, and she's the first woman of color to become president of the City Bar in the year of its 150th anniversary. Sheila's historic presidency began this past June amidst the pandemic and our country's reckoning with racial injustice. She's led the City Bar through the transition to the virtual new normal. And in that new normal, the City Bar's committees are more active than ever, all under the theme of Sheila's presidency, #Bar of Hope. Sheila's a litigation partner at Arnold & Porter K. Scholler LLP. She specializes in mass torts, product liability, and other complex litigation. And she's a graduate of Princeton University and Columbia Law School. And she's been active in the City Bar since her days as a junior associate. Thank you so much, Sheila, for giving our opening remark. I'll turn it over to you.
Black lives matter. Blue lives matter. I yearn for the day where in this country, it is fundamentally true that all lives matter. Can I get an amen out there? As president of the New York City Bar Association, I am so excited about today. And I have to tell you, I am still optimistic and I am still full of hope because I know, in the words of Sam Cooke, that a change is gonna come, y'all. Good morning, beloved New York City Bar. So excited to be here. I wanna thank all of you for joining us for this very important discussion today. One which frankly checks 2 boxes for my initiatives, if not 3. So it definitely is criminal justice reform and diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as I wanna go ahead and throw in access to justice. You know, I have 6 pillars of this presidency. So I'm very excited. And you know, a few months ago, in the wake of the death of George Floyd, I had the honor of moderating another panel. It was a stellar group of folks. I want to remind you, it was Loretta Lynch, former Attorney General of the United States, former Camden Chief of Police, J. Scott Thompson. We had Lorenzo Boyd, PhD from the University of New Haven. We had Nicole Austin Hillary, who heads the US program of Human Rights Watch. And we had Paul Fishman, former US Attorney for the District of New Jersey, and he is now my partner at Arnold & Porter. It was a great panel. Now, although we did take a look at Camden, New Jersey as a case study, if you will, at the last panel, we discussed the challenges and proposed police reform measures from a national perspective. And I promised all of you that we weren't done with the topic. We would come back, and that the next time we would focus in on our home, New York City. And so here we are. I want to thank all of the past panelists. I want to thank my beloved Terry. I love her so much. Terry Rosenblatt and her entire committee, the Criminal Courts Committee. And I am just going to go ahead and introduce our moderator for today because we have another stellar group of panelists and I can't wait to hear what they have to say. So leading us through today's discussion is Graeme Raymond. Graeme Raymond is a reporter with the New York Daily News, specializing in criminal justice and policing. He previously was a staff writer with The Village Voice and a senior writer with Newsday. Mr. Raymond has covered a wide range of events and issues during his 30 years and has won a number of awards for his work. Kept it short and sweet. He's the man today. I'm very excited about him leading us through this discussion, a continuation of the discussion we had already begun several months ago. And we're going to keep discussing this until we get it right, until a change comes. So with that, I welcome and introduce to you Graeme Raymond. Please take it away.
Good morning. Thank you so much. I don't know about you folks, but I feel like I've had a couple of birthdays over the last 11 months. It's been quite a year. The police department has been taxed from police headquarters down to the patrol officer on the street by the pandemic. The murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis galvanized this, or was a catalyst for long building criticism of police tactics and triggered broad demand for changes around race and criminal justice, and then the protests that we saw earlier this year. And violent crime surged through November 8th. Murder is up 38%, or about 110 murders more than this same period last year. The number of people shot has doubled to 1,635 through November 8th compared to last year. And I thought this was interesting that auto crime, distilled in the department statistics as grand larceny auto, is up 65% through November 8th, meaning that roughly more than 3,000 more cases of auto theft have been recorded. In the meantime, the Bar Association's report recently called for sweeping changes and referenced a cycle of unnecessary use of force in policing in the city. So I think it would be fair for the average New Yorker to be wondering where we are, where are we, and where are we going? And so let's have a discussion with our distinguished panelists. First Deputy Commissioner for the New York City Police Department, Benjamin Tucker. Dawit Gedichu, Policy Counsel with Bronx Defenders. Deanna Logan, Deputy Director of Crime Strategies and Acting General Counsel, the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. And Ju Yun Kang, Director of Communities United for Police Reform. Thank you all for being here. Commissioner Tucker, I just want to start with you. As a young man in Bed-Stuy, I understand you were hassled by the police and had some ambivalence about becoming a cop. And then once you did, you've spent 50 years with the NYPD. And having that perspective, in real terms for the average young man that we're talking about here, which is the critical population, how has that landscape changed for the better in your view?
Oh, it's interesting, Graeme. Thank you very much. First of all, thanks for the invitation from the City Bar. Appreciate you hosting this forum, a really important one, this conversation I'm looking forward to. Yeah, Graeme, the landscape has changed in some respects, but it hasn't changed as much as you might expect in 50 years. Certainly, for me, this journey has been very personal, but also the personal journey and my experiences has helped me in my professional career to look at and think about policy and reform and such as the conversations we're having today throughout my career. So the challenges we face some of them are extraordinarily systemic, clearly. And certainly the idea, the issue of police community relations, certainly with respect to especially policing in communities of color, continues to be over the years. And there's an ebb and a flow to it. I think by and large, I think we've made improvements here in New York City for sure. I'm not suggesting that we're out of the woods in any respect, but I think that in particular, the reform efforts that we've been engaged in the last 7 years, roughly, which is one of the reasons I came back, have been profound, actually. Do we still have issues with use of force or unnecessary use of force? Indeed. But I think progress has been made, particularly as it relates to our connection to communities. We strive in many ways, and we can talk more about it perhaps through questions and so forth. But I'll have an opportunity, hopefully, to talk a little bit about some of those reform efforts and what they've looked like and how far we've come. But certainly, as Sheila pointed out, and I think correctly so, when we think about George Floyd's death and how we all experienced that, it sort of, for me, and I think for the country and certainly for the city, been a flashpoint and sort of introduce this idea of change and reform and police community relations, and I think raises your question about whether or not things have improved. And I think the better question is how much have they improved here in the city versus perhaps where other jurisdictions are across the country. I happen to think we're out ahead of most of our colleagues in many ways when it comes to use of force, when it comes to training, when it comes to how we use technology, when it comes to, certainly given that we are New York City, when it comes to counterterrorism and so forth. So those are, I have to give you, these are just, I guess, the high points that I would just reference. But I do think, for me, the journey has been, I haven't spent all my time here, the entire 50 years working in NYPD. I was gone for 22 years, 25 years after having served 22 years, and then came back in 2014. And so I've been here and been involved with and engaged in shaping policy and shaping training and discipline and a whole range of other areas of responsibility, all, I think, to the end of bringing us forward, making progress, connecting us and grounding us better in communities out there. And in particular, I think connecting with young people. So I'll leave it there, just and we can talk more later, I hope.
Thank you, Commissioner. I made a mistake. I apologize. Everyone was supposed to have a short opening statement, and Commissioner Tucker was first, and now we turn to Mr. Getachew from Bronx Defenders.
Thank you, Graeme, and thank you to the City Bar for having me on this panel and for having this important conversation. Certainly, it's really good to see my fellow panelists, specifically Commissioner Tucker, who's had such a long experience in the police department and has a historical perspective of how things have changed, but also how things continue to remain the same. And, I want to recount two particular incidents. On June 4th of this year, the NYPD led an operation to trap, assault, and arrest almost 250 peaceful protesters in Mott Haven, which is a majority Black and brown neighborhood in the South Bronx. And the people who were at the protest faced violent and repressive response at the hands of the police. Many suffered serious injuries. Legal and medical workers who were observing the protests were detained, and those who were arrested were held for hours with no information provided to their families as to their whereabouts. And I've been talking a lot about this incident, not just because it happened in the Bronx where I work as a public defender, but also because there was an extensive investigation done by Human Rights Watch, which found that the police actions by the NYPD were planned and executed accordingly, and that there were violations of human rights law. And I mentioned this incident to a gentleman who lives in my neighborhood in Harlem, and he recalled how the events this summer reminded him of the Harlem riots of 1964, which happened before my time, but they occurred following the death of James Powell, a 15-year-old boy who was shot and killed by the NYPD officer in Harlem. And the protest that lasted 6 days following his death were put down by the NYPD in the same manner as it did in June in the Bronx, with overwhelming force, with police officers assaulting and arresting hundreds of Black residents. And I found these two events that are separated by over 50 years to be particularly instructive in preparing for this panel, not just because it's a reminder that Black New Yorkers of every generation can point to incidents of police violence and the death of Black men at the hands of the police as some sort of grim historical marker, but also to confront the reality that New York City has repeatedly confronted these issues of police violence and has made promises to Black and Brown communities when it comes to policing to bring meaningful police transparency and accountability, and to allow people to live in safety and with dignity from both police and community violence, and has repeatedly failed to live up to these promises. And there have been a number of reforms over the years, which we can talk about at the panel. But I would argue that the NYPD has never been a willing partner in these efforts. We have seen time and time again how the department was forced to change its practices only after facing class action lawsuits or scandals that leaked through the press, or New Yorkers marching in the streets, as we have seen this year. The reality is the conversation in public safety has revolved almost exclusively around policing at the expense of other issues, other systemic issues. Meager efforts of reform that have failed to address not only the issues of police transparency and accountability, but also the deeper socioeconomic problems of racism, housing shortages, and chronic unemployment or underemployment that plague communities of color to this day.
Thank you.
And
thank you. I'm sorry that's
no.
I'm just going to move. We just wanted to. I appreciate that. Ms. Logan.
Hi, good morning, everybody. And I too thank the bar for having us here this morning. And I'm grateful to all of my esteemed colleagues and panelists to have this conversation. I had prepared remarks that were a lot longer, and given how we've started out with meaty issues, I kind of want to forego the long one, but just to hit a couple of very clear points in that I do know that this is a conversation that is a conversation, as DeWitt Gedeshu has just talked about, that we have been in for a while. But I do, as much as I hear friends and colleagues talk about that this is a repeated conversation, I don't feel that we're in the same moment over and over again as we sit here today. Because when I think about the conversations that have happened, yes, we have been having them in hallowed halls of the Bar Association. We've been having them amongst community activists and government, and it hasn't been, for me, in this moment, as pervasive as it is with the everyday citizen across the country having this conversation. But even more importantly about the conversation is a renewed and even bubbling commitment to act and to actually really take meaningful steps towards having change, and not just being a conversation, but an action to moving forward. And so I think if we look at what's going on in this moment, we are all recognizing that there is this problem, but there are much more people that are committed to acting to fix the problem. And in that action, we also, as academics and community members, people of color, and just citizens of New York, also have to recognize that that action is dealing with the actual diseases, as you raised, of inequalities and the not living up to the promise of what America should be for all of its citizens, and that the things that we're seeing in policing and the problems are an additional symptom of a bigger disease. And it's how do we start to talk about dealing with the symptoms, but making sure that we actually are committed to curing that disease of inequality and the promise that has not been given to Black and Brown communities in this country.
Thank you so much, Ms. Logan. I appreciate that. Ms. Kang?
Mr. Raymond, just to double check, are we still doing 5 minutes of introduction? Because I just want to do some fast slides, or are we changing that?
Yeah, just spend a couple of minutes framing as Ms. Logan just did, framing the conversation as you would like to do it.
Great. So if I can figure out this, sorry, one moment. So I just wanted to do 3 quick slides. I'll put myself on a timer, and Graeme certainly interrupt me at any point if I'm running over. But I think that part of this conversation can't be had unless we name some of the major issues related to police reform. And first, let me also thank the New York City Bar Association for having me and Communities Night for Police Reform on this, the fellow panelists for your prior remarks. One is just what we would characterize as a refusal of the NYPD to fire officers who kill, brutalize, engage in gender-based and other kind of violence against New Yorkers. Pretty systemically. There are some exceptions, but usually because there are court mandates or court cases that require firing of those officers. Secondly, that there's a very outsized and bloated $6 billion budget, which actually leads to $11 billion of taxpayer money being spent on policing in New York City, when much of that money can be redirected in ways to strengthen community safety. Third is the longstanding issue of lack of transparency and secrecy of the NYPD as a whole. And fourth is what I will say we believe to be the de Blasio administration's amplification of when NYPD top officials issue falsehoods and also refuse to hold the NYPD accountable. That includes repeating the falsehood that $1 billion was taken from the NYPD this year in the budget. That did not happen. That's been disproven repeatedly. And then lastly, just being aware of cosmetic reforms, and we can talk more about that during the discussion. Secondly, I just want to go a little bit into what I described in the first point in terms of the NYPD discipline scandals. So that includes that, as many of you saw in the New York Times reporting this past weekend, that since 2001, only 7 officers who had CCRB substantiated complaints were actually fired by the NYPD, and that the NYPD routinely rejects, downgrades, and obstructs many of those CCRB cases. Now, that doesn't even take into account cases that the NYPD is investigating that are not civilian complaint review board cases. So for example, for the 5-year period between 2014 and 2019, there were close to 3,000 racial profiling and other discriminatory profiling complaints. 0 of them were substantiated by the Internal Affairs Bureau of the NYPD, 0. And that should be a shocking number to understand how the systemic issues and refusal of discipline go deep in the NYPD. The recent public awareness around brutal protest policing, as DeWitt had talked about, and then if there's time later, I'd love to talk about some of the cases right now of police killings of people like Kowalski Trawick, Delron Small, Antonio Williams, and even other officers involved in killing Eric Garner who have not been disciplined or fired. And lastly, I just want to say that part of what I think we need to do in talking about public safety in this city is really be willing to engage in a bold redefinition of public safety that centers the basic needs and protections of people's rights. So as DeWitt said, as the commissioner noted, as Deanna noted, there are many different systemic issues that are challenges in the lives of New Yorkers right now, especially during this pandemic, whether it's housing insecurity, food insecurity, public health issues, and that where we should start is the question of what will make New York City communities healthy and safe, not necessarily what only improves policing. We have to start with a different question that is a much broader question than improving police community relations, which I would argue is actually not the point of what we're trying to do. And thirdly, that as a city, we need to be really willing to move resources from a bloated NYPD budget into community infrastructure programs and services that really benefit, center, and strengthen community safety. I'm going to stop there. And I think I say it in my 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So let's go from the general to the specific. And just talk about that. I mean, all of you have spoken about very broad things, but is there, you know, let's be realistic. There's a big institution. These are big issues. Is there one significant thing that you would like to see done? And, you know, of course, this goes for Commissioner Tucker as well. Is there something specific you'd like to see done in the near term that's practically achievable within all of these very large issues? If you were forced to choose a priority, each of you, what would that be? I'm sorry, you're muted, Commissioner.
Sorry about that, Graeme. You know, I think, you know, there are lots of things, as I said, issues that we've attempted and in fact begun to address over these past few years. And so you know, the whole process that we're talking about as it's been framed certainly needs to, I think, it's cumulative. It is one in which what I heard from DeWitt and from Deanna and Julian as well is this notion of the systemic challenges that we face. I think certainly police reform is important, absolutely important, and we should continue to do what we've been doing in the department and are engaged in right now in terms of listening sessions, hearing from the public, giving them an opportunity to really share with us some of the current concerns that they continue to have. And so that will be helpful. But in the meantime, we've addressed a number of the issues, obviously not to everyone's satisfaction, but focused on transparency, focused on discipline and holding officers accountable. And so use of force in particular is something that we focused on and really rewrote our use of force policies, made them more coherent, collect much more data than we've ever collected before, and make that data available publicly. It's public facing on our website, as is our discipline information in light of the abolition of 50A. We can now make a lot of that information available, and will as soon as we're able, following some current litigation. But so I think that those for me are that our focus has been on and taking these steps, some baby steps, some much broader, the notion of neighborhood policing, things like that. I think the cumulative impact of those things will bring us and have brought us forward.
Commissioner, Commissioner, if I may interject, the department has brought in the disciplinary matrix. In the case of Francisco Garcia, the officer who kneeled on the neck of a arrest subject earlier this year, we saw his discipline case brought rapidly to close to trial before he decided to resign. And in the Eric Garner case, we saw 5 years elapse before that disciplinary case involving Officer Pantaleo was adjudicated finally. Are we going to see more of a rapid move? You know, one of the big complaints both from outside and inside the department is these disciplinary cases go on forever. The outcomes are not disclosed, and I think many cops have told me that they see people with open disciplinary cases that go on for 2-3 years. So it's an issue on both within the rank and file and from without. Is the department going to be moving faster on discipline?
You, you're a little frozen, Graeme. I'm not. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Chief Tucker. We can't hear Graeme at this moment. I think we may be having technical difficulties there.
Yeah, his screen is frozen. It appears,
Maybe we give him a chance to catch up to you, but if you want to just
Yeah, I
address
should
his
just-
last question about
Right.
whether the department is going to be
The
moving
speed
faster.
with- Yeah, I think, well, the short answer is absolutely, and we've begun to do that. And the Garcia case is one example, but there were a number of cases that occurred around the same time as Garcia engaged in that conduct that he did back on the Lower East Side, but also some of those events that took place during the protests that we're all familiar with and saw on screen, and address those expeditiously. And yes, the whole purpose for focusing on discipline was to level the playing field, to make discipline in the department more fair, make sure it was expeditious. We made lots of changes in that regard. The Department Advocate's Office, which is the equivalent of our prosecutor for our administrative disciplinary process, I made changes there in leadership. Just recently, we have a brand new department advocate, Amy Litwin. We now have, as you all know, as a result of the disciplinary panel that was convened in 2018, I think Graeme is back with us, I think. In 2018, that panel issued 13 recommendations, every one of which we agreed with and have implemented. We're in the process of expediting the hiring of a portion of the attorneys, the group of attorneys, 9 attorneys that we sought approval to bring on as in response to the recommendation coming from the panel, for example, as well as the community liaison, who will be, with respect to transparency, a source for individuals who can have the conversations with Nancy Slater, who's now the Assistant Deputy Commissioner in the Department Advocate's Office, who will stand in that role as the liaison as well. So there are a number of, when it comes to discipline and expediting those cases, we are moving with all deliberate speed as often and as well as we can. And just a final comment with respect to the Garner case. Certainly, I won't go into the long explanation or even make excuses. There are lots of reasons why that dragged on for 5 years, some of which had to do with our, routine process of basically deferring to our district attorneys or special prosecutors in some instances, certainly, but also trying to allow, and maybe even the federal government in the Garner case, that was part of that process. And so we've learned a valuable lesson in that regard, which is there are now, and we have begun to do this, which is we look at individual cases, and when they occur, and even when they may be prosecuted criminally, we make a determination as to the efficacy of deferring to the prosecutors, not without having conversations with them, but we will think about, and certainly on the federal level, of course, as well, think about whether or not it's in our best interest to move ahead and in the best interests of the city.
Thank you, Commissioner. Let me bring everybody else in. What are you folks seeing on discipline, and do you like what you're seeing so far?
Can I just jump here? I want to respond to one thing that the Commissioner raised in terms of starting with the Eric Garner case. There's 3 things I want to say. One is in relationship to the Eric Garner case. We can go back and forth about the past, and our position that was never correct for the department to delay the case for as long as it did. And in fact, there had been precedent where the department had not done that. In the 90s, after Anthony Baez was killed, Francis Labode was fired before the DOJ actually took action. However, there are still officers like Justin D'Amico who lied in official reports who are still on the force in relationship to the Eric Garner case. And so we would argue that actually the only places where we've seen the department move quickly is when there is tremendous public outcry, for example, with Francisco Garcia, and that that level of public outcry should never be necessary. So another example would be the killing of Delron Small. That was 4 years ago. Wayne Isaacs is still on the force right now. CCRB substantiated charges last month. Those charges have not been served by the NYPD on Wayne Isaacs yet. Another example is Kowalski Treywick, who was killed last year. A video related to his killing was released yesterday or 2 days ago by the Bronx DA's office that shows that the NYPD officers involved escalated at every step of that encounter, resulting in his killing. So I think that there's a huge problem and scandal in terms of lack of discipline, meaningful discipline, and firing of officers who kill, brutalize, and engage in misconduct against New Yorkers. I did want to go back to Graeme, your original question, though, in terms of if there was only one thing we could do right now, what would it be? And I think for Community United for Police Reform, it would be to reduce the NYPD's bloated $6 billion budget and remove police from various areas, including mental health, all mental health encounters, homeless outreach and services, schools, and youth outreach.
Thank you. Ms. Logan, where do you stand on the, is that even practical? I mean, removing some of those responsibilities from the department, you know, are these other entities really going to be functional in a practical sense? Like 3 in the morning, are they, you know, are they really going to show up? We rely on the police department for pretty much every problem that we have in many respects.
Yeah, and I think that that is a concern, right? Relying on the police department to do things that they are not equipped and are not the professionals in. And so the idea of practical is not really the question that I would ask. It would be more framing it in terms of, are we as a society ready to put in the requisite resources to make sure that those things can actually happen, right? So it's not about practicality, it's about identifying the areas that must be changed, that need to have the professionals in those spaces that are capable and ready to meet the needs of society, and then making sure that we invest the resources in them to make them function and to have meet the needs of our citizenry. And so that, I think, is one of the very important things that we need to look at in imagining, and going back to Juhan's question about what safety looks like and how we define that, and how do we define that safety, and is that safety defined by making sure that we identify the areas where a police and criminality of being homeless or being somebody who is poor, or somebody with mental health issues, is something that does not deserve a police response, but that needs the services of those individuals that are equipped and capable of doing that, and that we make sure that whoever those professionals are, we give them the tools that they need to do that job. And DeWitt, I saw that you were unmuting, so I turn over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Deanna. Graeme, I would push back against the notion that like these ideas are not feasible or some sort of pie in the sky proposals, because we've seen other places which have implemented other ways of handling responses, such as with mental health. But more importantly, we as a city haven't truly committed to making these changes. So, for example, there was a recent proposal by Brad Lander regarding to push the NYPD away from traffic enforcement, to reduce the involvement of police officers in these types of like low-level traffic enforcement. And unfortunately, our elected officials our mayor specifically, have pushed back against that, indicating that like the police need to continue to be involved in these types of things. And we've seen it in other areas as well, including in schools. So what we have is a reluctance to really take the steps that are necessary in order to change how we're addressing the issues of public safety and the needs of the community that are like impacted by this, and often lead to the unfortunate and violent encounters between police and New Yorkers.
Graeme, if I may.
Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I don't disagree with Deanna or DeWitt. I think the notion of how we address, I mean, police role and yeah, we usually are the people who are going to show up. And I think there are a number of jurisdictions and we've tried it here in the city with co-response as it relates to the mentally ill, for example. And I've dealt with that 30 plus years ago in the Koch administration. We were having this exact same conversation in many ways about the same issue. And the challenge is, and it's as everyone has already mentioned, around systemic challenges. The policing is certainly, law enforcement is one part of it, but I think, as it's been pointed out, when we talk about housing and healthcare and education and mental illness and homelessness, those issues, drug addiction, the things in society that we've ignored for decades on end, without any real leadership that actually focuses on those issues. And so when people are having trouble and they're concerned about their loved one being off their medication or whatever the challenges are, or they need help because they've been threatened or whatever it might be, they call 911 and the police will show up every single time. And so that's not just true here in New York City. It is true across the country. And that's part of the challenge we have.
Certainly.
I add that I don't think that there's a way to talk about that challenge, though, without talking about the city budget. Meaning that if you look at the de Blasio years, we did a report, we did some research with Center for Popular Democracy and King's Night for Police Reform that looked at the number of dollars going to the police department versus other kinds of services. So when we looked at it, part of what it revealed was that for every dollar that went to the NYPD, that was more than the combination of what went to Department of Youth and Community Development, Workforce Development, Department of Homeless Services, and Department of Health. And that actually shows such a huge problem with how our city has prioritized public resources.
Is just, if I may interject, isn't the reality that the majority of the NYPD's budget is tied up in personnel costs? I mean, just salaries.
It's over 90%.
Right.
I mean, certainly, Ben, you
Right.
should correct me if I'm wrong, but it's
Yeah.
over 90%.
No, you're right. It is more than it's close to 95%. So it is. It's personnel. We have 55,000 people, and so and when you think about the services that we provide, we could debate this, but I think Ju-Yoon, your point has merit, because we do, when it comes to thinking about the budget, thinking about how we solve these problems, the budget is going to be key. And so whoever's in leadership position has to really think about it. And I'm not just talking about the local level, the state levels matters here as well, if we're talking about public housing as an example, but in other ways, and education as well. There needs to be a commitment to looking at how we attack these systemic problems. I mean, we don't have institutions where people, shelters are important because those are temporary spaces for people who might be homeless to be. But on the other hand, we really need to be able to provide some sort of and invest in some sort of services that will allow us to respond as a community, as a city, to people who need the help And on the mental illness side, those institutions have been gone for decades, and you might argue that's probably good because they weren't perhaps very effective back then. But we do need to think about what the alternatives are for that whole process. So the discussion may begin with certainly police reform, and that may make sense. But we also need to think about, where those dollars, where else we need to invest as well to deal with those problems, which then may also be effective in shrinking the criminal justice, not just the police, but the criminal justice budget overall.
I'm sorry, please.
I was just going to say, I think that just to add to what Ben just said, I think it's not just an issue of the services, right? It's got to be in the context of understanding that community infrastructure in Black, Latinx, and other communities of color have been defunded for decades. And so we're not just talking about a one-year budget change that needs to happen. There needs to be a huge, deep reinvestment in communities. So that includes housing, so that it's not shelters, that there's actually permanent housing that's affordable for everyone in New York, and every single person in New York City is housed. That will actually help us in so many directions, that nobody has food insecurity. So we can go through the list, but that is part of what we're talking about in terms of re-looking at how we think about public health and public safety that doesn't center the NYPD.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I was having a conversation with a sergeant that I know who's in the Housing Bureau, and he made a joke. It's not really a joke. He said, if you're in the PSA in North Brooklyn, you don't have any connections in the department. And yet at the same time, so there's this perception in the rank and file, rightly or wrongly, that being assigned to housing is not a preferred assignment. However, at the same time, there's a concentration of violent crime coming out of there. Can the department and the city do a better job of recognizing those two things, that the confluence of those two things, and trying to come up with a way to address both of those? I mean, why should a land sergeant feel like working in housing is, it's the front line for a lot of the violent crime that we see.
Yeah, but see, I think that rhetoric and that law and order and there's violent crime is a part of a bigger narrative of trying to continuously paint Black and brown neighborhoods and communities as unsafe and people that need to be contained, and putting, the most inexperienced officers in neighborhoods where they're primary hyperly focused on getting home safe, and not that we as police are going into communities to protect and serve, and we're working with community, and community is there with us. So when you have that overarching narrative of fear and potentially feeling like what you're going to work is if you're going into a Black and brown neighborhood, you're going into a war zone, then you're going to have this perpetuating system of distrust, fear, and a narrative that may not necessarily represent the full panoply of what is going on in that neighborhood. I'm not saying that there are not violent crimes that happen in Black and brown neighborhoods, but we as a city have violent crimes that happen everywhere. And if we keep simply just focusing on Black and brown neighborhoods as epicenters of violent crime, yes, there is gunplay, yes, there are violent crimes that happen, but we need to start focusing on what are the things that we do to make all of the neighborhoods safer, better. And I think that brings us right back to where we started, which is investments and making sure that everybody has a home, that there is a fundamental basic understanding of what living should look like.
But Deanna, can I just jump in just here? Because I disagree a little bit with some of what you said. I mean, you framed it in a way that suggests that somehow that's the mentality of policing public housing, that police, that's the way, if you accept this sergeant's description of it. I'm not sure that all of his colleagues feel that way, number one, but more importantly, we have these conversations and we tend to forget about the victims, the people who live in whatever neighborhood, but certainly communities of color where a lot of the shootings are taking place, and whether it's public housing or just neighborhoods where I grew up, in Bed-Stuy, or in Williamsburg, or in in Bushwick or in Uptown or in the Bronx. So their neighborhoods, the police are there because they need to be there, because the people who live there deserve to be safe. And so, yeah, the gangs are there, and we work hard to try and do gang takedowns, take these folks off the street, so that people aren't being shot indiscriminately, and as these folks shoot at each other and people are being shot in the head while riding buses and that sort of thing, or sitting on their lap, you have little kids dying. Those kinds of things are real. And so I think the notion that somehow we shouldn't be policing those neighborhoods is not, you have to police them. I mean, the argument comes out often about disparate impact policing in the neighborhoods we're talking about. But when you speak to the people who live in those neighborhoods, and I do, they will tell you that they're not looking to get rid of the police. They want the police. They just want the police, when they are there, to treat them with respect and to do their job and keep their community safe. So I think as we talk about this and how we frame it really does matter. We don't send police officers in the street to go out there and go to these neighborhoods. I mean, in the 60s, that was your description would be valid when I grew up and I was living in these neighborhoods back then. I like to think that, and I believe we have made significant progress in that respect. And one of the things, the other thing about public housing is when you think about community policing, when you talk to officers who worked housing before the merger, they will tell you, and if you talk to the citizens, they will also confirm it, and the tenants associations and all of them, that made a difference. They were, the housing officers were the ones who really, when it came to whatever the label is, but whenever how you connected with community, the officers knew that they could rely on doing public safety as a shared responsibility. They could rely on the citizens to pick up a phone and call if that officer was in trouble, and vice versa. The officers were paying attention, and they knew their neighbors. They knew the people who lived on their beat and so forth. So that's what neighborhood policing is what we've attempted to do with neighborhood policing in the broader sense, to bring that to neighborhoods all across the city. And it's a work in progress, but I think that progress has been made to some degree, and it's making a difference just based on some of the feedback that we receive.
Graeme, if I could jump in, I don't think that there's disagreements that these communities want to feel safe and value being able to walk in their neighborhoods without fear of violence. The issue here is really about the response and the methods that are being used by the NYPD in responding to these issues. And the commissioner mentioned gang takedowns, for example, as a way of controlling the violence and so on. But these types of responses often have devastating consequences to this very same communities that they purport to protect. So, for example, if we look back at the numerous gang takedowns that have happened over the past decade, where police, working with federal agents, go in and arrest like 120 people at one time, and essentially extract people, entire neighborhoods from their families, and use RICO prosecutions to wrangle pleas from people who are remotely connected to actual gang members and folks who are who don't have who are not contributing to the violence that are being claimed by the police. These are tactics that have significant consequence, not just on people's lives, but also on the perception of the community towards the police. How they see the police is not as an agency which is coming to protect them, but really as an invading force that's coming in with militarized gear and taking away their children. So it's a reality that we can't pretend that these things are separate. We can't pretend that public safety, the idea of the public safety under the NYPD comes at significant cost for communities of color. So I think it's important to remember all these things as we are discussing it.
In your view, then certainly gang and RICO investigations are part of the fabric of, and also buy and bus, and is there a direction you would like to see the department go in that de-emphasizes those kinds of, those are two very different operations obviously, but is there a direction you would like to see them go in that would address that issue you're talking about?
Well, I'll address the issue of buy and bust, which again, another police practice that essentially criminalizes people who are substance users, and at a tremendous cost to both taxpayers as well as the lives of the people who are struggling with substance abuse, often with very little to show for it. So I certainly think that the enforcement of low-level possession of drugs is something that should be completely deprioritized, and the NYPD shouldn't necessarily be enforcing it. And we've seen in Oregon, for example, which has decriminalized low-level possession recently, and those are like some of the steps that need to happen in order to address these issues. And certainly funding alternatives to enforcing the law through using the police by providing resources to treatment programs and centers is one possibility that could be explored.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to touch on this one, just as it relates to the protest, just very kind of narrowly. We don't have to have a whole discussion about the protest, but I was struck by the uniforms that the bike officers are now wearing. It's very dramatic, dark blue, very, very dark blue uniforms with sort of plastic armor on. And I wonder if that's, and the helmets have changed. They're more like motorcycle helmets. I just wonder if that's part of the disconnect here, that there's the image of those officers and then who those sort of, and that's the impression that comes. There's a message being sent by those uniforms. And then that's why you get a reaction, even though it's just a uniform. It's not the person inside the uniform. It's not what the department is looking for. Do you guys want to talk a little about that sort of message and how it relates to what happened earlier this year?
I can, just to put some context around this. We hear, these terms, militarization of policing, and I think in some jurisdictions that's true, perhaps, and I know it was true back in the 90s, and there were it was equipment that departments were buying, not NYPD. We don't own any vehicles that are militarized, for the purpose of certainly going into communities, to police communities that way. But with respect to the uniforms, I've heard that a lot, and the nature of the uniform and so forth. Listen, it just to put it in context, you've seen our strategic response group which used to be the task forces around the city. We trained them the same way that we trained our critical response group, and you've seen them on the streets, and you see them, the heavy vests and the dark uniforms and the M4 rifles. This is, police work is, you're there for a reason. You're there to protect people. And so, the uniform is an important factor because you need heavy vests. You've got these huge bulletproof vests under that that will take rounds that may be used against them. And that's our counterterrorism task force. I mean, we specifically train those officers so that they can respond to active shooter situations and certainly any terrorist threats that we get throughout the city, but certainly in Manhattan. So, and the same thing is true with the bikes, I think, as well. And if we talk about the protests, we talk about trying to be nimble, trying to get officers out there to be able to move through the crowds, move with the crowds, peaceful protests for sure, but also to be able to deal with the kinds of challenges that we faced during the summer with the folks who were out there to hijack the peaceful protests so that they can engage in criminal conduct and in particular to attack police.
Commissioner,
just for context.
Yeah, Commissioner, if I may, I was just sort of raising that those uniforms are very different from the bike uniforms that we've seen in the past, which are much more like shorts and safety vest with of course the ballistic vest underneath, but it's just a different look, and and it may lead to a different impression by the people who are marching or whatever about what the message is that the department is sending.
That's an interesting point.
Just on, would anyone else like to comment on that before we move to the questions from the audience?
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, I think that part of what you're highlighting, Graeme, is that those uniforms, and it's not just the uniforms, it's the absolutely outsized massive presence of SRG and other officers at protests since this summer. That is both unnecessary, but also that massive presence actually sends a signal to people who are protesting, who are gathering to mourn somebody who was killed by the police, that they are the target. And we've been critical of the idea that the Strategic Response Group, which is supposed to be a counterterrorism group, has policing a protest as part of their mandate from the very beginning. We don't believe that should even be something that SRG does. But when you look at what's happened since this summer, even into the last weeks, of how the NYPD has reacted to protesters, it's pretty abominable, actually. There's been many, many examples of officers just acting indiscriminately, whether it's pepper spraying people, using brutal force, using force when it's unnecessary, cutting people off. That's not actually protecting protesters. And so part of the dynamic we have in this city is also in this period of time before the elections, when Commissioner Shea said that there would be a expanded police presence at election sites, and also at protests in case of quote unquote election violence. That was part of a trend of actually criminalizing protests, is how we see it. And the last thing I just want to say though is that the police at these protests have been able to act with impunity. I don't know that anybody has been fired for how they behaved over the summer or the past few weeks even. And so that sends a signal that police are actually not there to protect protesters. And many of these protests would say that they don't need the police there to protect them.
Sure. I mean, I think that isn't there sort of you have what the department would like its cops to do, and then you have individual situations where things get out of control, and it's, I think that the massive presence point you made is something that the department can control. And then, well, I'm just kind of rambling here. Why don't we go to the questions? Who's handling the questions from the audience? Sorry, I apologize. A little disorganization here. All right, I'm just going to go through the questions here that we have written down. If you just bear with me. One of the recommendations, one of the questions is, one of the recommendations from the Bar Association report is that the unions, the police unions, be taken out of bargaining as it relates to discipline. Commissioner Tucker, where would you stand on that? And the other panelists, where would you stand on that? This is, I think the unions would probably go to war over that proposal.
Well, I think fundamentally, I mean, listen, discipline is, as I mentioned earlier, is, we're trying to level the playing field, but certainly depending on the nature of the discipline, and not the minor offenses that might be, that won't be going to a trial room, for example, to our trial room, or maybe even rise to the level of the more serious nature of our discipline process, which is charges and specifications. But certainly they're entitled to counsel. And so the unions, that's one of the things that the unions provide for that purpose. So I think simply put, I mean, I'm not sure what the mechanism would be if the unions weren't doing it.
But that's different from, I mean, the unions, the PBA pays for lawyers to defend officers all the time. That's different from discipline being in collective bargaining, and discipline in New York City is not part of police collective bargaining. It's not allowed to be part of police collective bargaining in New York City. And I think it should stay that way. We should actually make sure that no part of the disciplinary process can be negotiated as part of collective bargaining agreements by the PBA or the other 4 police unions. There are 5 police unions in New York City.
Ms. Logan, where does Mokche stand on that proposal? I'm sure, Mayor de Blasio has had his conflicts with the unions over various issues. Do you have a sense of that?
I wouldn't want to speak for the mayor on that topic. What I would say is that when you think about discipline, it feeds very much into accountability and the trust that needs to happen with community. And therefore, it would not be something that would lead to trust if it is something that is part of a collective bargaining pattern where there seems to be something that already makes a predisposed statement as to how misconduct should be treated. And so in thinking about discipline and in thinking about how we strengthen accountability, those are all options and things that are open to review. And when we think about how we are going to reform policing in New York City.
Mr. Gedichu, do you have, no? Okay.
And just so I'm clear, just to be clear, that they, unions don't set penalties and they don't have input, so they don't collectively bargain to engage in that process. So I'm not, that's why I made my comment about, the notion that they do provide, as Drew Yoon mentioned, counsel for officers who are in trouble. But when it comes to the penalty side of the ledger, as is dictated by the matrix that we just put forth, those presumptive penalties are what they are, and so officers who are governed by that are within that framework. So they're disciplined according to those presumptions in the categories that we've outlined the penalties in. So I don't think we're in a position, we're not at the place where somehow there's this insidious involvement between unions and their ability to govern in any way the disciplinary process.
Although what I will say is that the PBA, the Sergeants Union in particular, and actually all the other unions, repeatedly and consistently defend officers who kill, brutalize, and engage in other misconduct. Not just in terms of legal, in terms of politics. And I think that it's important to just recognize and state the fact that the police unions in New York City have outsized political power and influence, whether it's in terms of blocking legislation that they don't want to go forward, or whether it's in terms of basically trying to demand that officers not be disciplined. And so, you know, I'd be curious to hear what others think, but I don't think that we could say that the police unions don't play an informal role in relationship to the absolute failure of the department to fire people, fire officers when they harm New Yorkers.
Is that a fair point, Commissioner?
Well, I do see part of the point, because I think Drew Eunice is correct. But still, when it comes to discipline, and that is something that happens through my office and the police commissioner's office. Ultimately, the unions don't dictate what penalties officers receive. So yeah, informally and the political issues as it's been described, yes, but that is not the disciplinary process. That is not part of the disciplinary process.
Thank you. See. There's a question, another question. Is the department moving towards a requirement for officers to live in the 5 boroughs they serve? I thought there was such a requirement.
No, there is no requirement. There used to be. There hasn't been, rather, for quite some time, a requirement that you live within the 5 boroughs. There is the ability to live in certain counties, and so, you know, Nassau, Suffolk, upstate, Westchester, and others, Orange, and so forth. There's a limit. But the interesting thing about this is, and there's a historical perspective that's linked to this notion that officers who don't live in the city, therefore not vested in how they police the city, and that was certainly the thinking back in the 60s, when a lot of the officers did, probably a significant amount of officers lived outside the city. Interestingly enough, since 2014, as we've been hiring, since then, we've roughly hired 13,000 plus officers in that time frame, you know, to adjust for people leaving the job, and to correct that. But many of the people, more than usually on average, we hire now quarterly, something I changed when I came back. Instead of hiring 1,200 officers at a time in one group, we spread that out over the year, quarterly. But in every one of the classes we've hired, probably, I don't think I'm mistaken here, but almost everyone that we've hired, those classes, more than 50% of the officers live in the city. And some jurisdictions have, you know, we've had all kinds of programs where they have houses, they make housing available. I think one of the challenges for our new officers that are not paid very well by comparison to other jurisdictions is that they, you know, many of them, when they first come on the job, they either are living at home, and so they are in the city, and so there are lots of proposals out there. People, I just received a number of comments from a business person and a group of business people in Brooklyn who sent me a document, a paper that they put together, asking for us to consider just this idea of residency and some sort of having to live in the city for some period of time before they move out, if they choose to. I think it used to be a problem, and it was primarily connected to race back then. When I came in the department in '69, probably 95+% of the officers were male white. That is no longer the case. We are a minority department, for example, and so the officers that we just hired this week, the 900 officers that we brought on last week, 39% of those officers are white, but 33 of those officers are Hispanic, 13.3% are Black, and 12.9% are Pacific Islanders. So when you add the numbers up, you see that the majority of that group are, and that's been consistent. And then I would, in this class, 61% of those folks live in the city.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'd like to ask a question about the bail reform change. It's now November, so those changes have been in place for almost a year. Ms. Logan, do you have a handle on what those changes have done, the positive elements of those changes, and negative? There's a perception in the NYPD that those changes may have contributed somehow to the crime surge, but there's a lot of information on the other side, which in fact it did not. Are you guys tracking?
So I think when we're looking at bail reform, we're in a very odd moment because we had a period of time where we saw bail, the shift from the law, and we did not necessarily see the recidivism that everybody anticipated. There was this idea that if you are not allowed to set bail on certain offenses, then you will see a large level of recidivism. Now, that doesn't mean that we didn't see reports of individuals that were highlighted as being recidivist, but overall seeing many people who are being connected to services, because at the same time that we did bail reform, we also made sure that we made significant investments in supervised release. We made significant investments in alternatives to incarceration. We started to make sure that there were beds in programs. So those wraparound services with bail reform, I don't think that we saw the recidivism that everybody anticipated. We're now in this era with COVID, and so there's other influences and things that would have to be taken into account with bail. But one of the things that we have seen just recently is the fact that when we're looking at bail, that there was this whole need of saying, there was a whole time where everybody was talking about making sure bail was set on cases, but what we're seeing is in cases where bail is set, the majority of people are making that bail and you're not seeing them reoffending. So it's not that bail is anything that is the contributor to safety. I think we conflate bail and safety in not really addressing the issue, right? Bail is set in New York for making sure that somebody comes back to court. It's that anchor that we as a society have said historically, we need to make sure you individual come back to court to address the charges that are against you. But here, even in these most recent months where we've seen judges increasing the number of cases that they set bail on and people making that bail, we're not seeing those individuals reoffending. And so I think we need to decouple bail and safety, right? Because they're two very separate issues.
Mr. Getachew, do you see that being with Bronx defenders and seeing these cases,
So yes, and I'll just start with just saying that the bail reforms have contributed to something that New York City should be proud of, which is we have dramatically reduced the number of people in cages in New York City jails and across New York State. That's something that's important. Certainly as something that we aspire to. The decarceration is an important goal for the city, partly because we know that pretrial detention has devastating consequences for people who are ensnared in the criminal legal system. We've seen how it impacts people's lives and their families, and how people lose their jobs, lose their housing as a result of having bail set that they can't afford. And we've seen how people languished just because they were too poor to pay for their freedom, essentially. And but what we have seen is since the beginning, of this year when the laws took into effect. And even really before then, there has been there's been efforts on the parts of law enforcement agencies and unions to undermine these reforms and really to scare people into rolling back these reforms. And they've been somewhat successful in doing that, but ultimately, what we're seeing here is, people are returning to their families. And, as Deanna mentioned, that we have not seen a connection between the bail reforms and the rise in violence, although some are claiming with, evidence that have yet to be seen. And more importantly, I think we were also seeing that there's been other cities that didn't have bail reform that also have seen a rise in violent crime. So the attempts by both, the commissioner of the New York Police Department, as well as other actors to completely undermine these reforms is an unfortunate scenario, and again contributes to this idea that the police are not necessarily willing partners in the efforts to improve the lives and the conditions of people who have to live under the criminal legal system.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that I don't know that Commissioner Tucker would agree that the department is trying to undermine all the changes. I'm interested in what he has to say about that.
Yeah,
because I'm sure it's
without a doubt. I think that observation is on point, Graeme. I listen. Bail reform was necessary. I mean, cash bail was a disaster. We all know it, and it did have a disparate impact on people of color, no question, and others who couldn't afford it. And so, yeah, bail reform was necessary, but to somehow suggest that and again, this goes for me. I always think about this through the victim lens. These folks, there are folks out there shooting at each other, and shooting and injuring other people, and getting caught up in those shootings. The violence is palpable. In many instances, and if you're interested in the data, I can show you the data. I'm not just saying this, I don't have any data with me, but I can tell you, I mean, listen, we cut our arrests, when we were bringing those numbers down, the crime numbers, just prior to even earlier this year, until we hit March and things started to go south. And I think we started to see them go south even before that. And that was, we believed at the time, connected to the implementation of the bail reform piece. But so no, I think what we have to do is again, this is all about balance. There's some people out there who are incredibly violent, committing these crimes, and we see the fact that they're going in and they're right back out on the streets. And the ones who are doing the shooting today are the ones when we arrive on the scene who have been shot and lying on the sidewalk dead. And these are mostly people of color shooting one another. And so, so I think, and so when it comes to bail reform and people are judges are setting bail, but there's still limits within the way the legislation has been drafted. So the bail is not prohibitive, and that's as it should be. But I do think, one of the ways we could address this is through just dangerousness. Judges, our judges are there. We trust their judgment. They ought to be able to decide that Ben Tucker, who now has been arrested with a gun, caught shooting a gun, shooting at people 15 times, and he's in and he's out and he's in and he's out. That is not a good thing for the community. No one benefits from that. And so, the goal should be for, if we could correct this situation, or at least modify it a bit by giving judges we're the only state, I think, now in the country that doesn't allow judges to consider dangerousness in addition to flight. for people who they believe and know just by looking at the data are dangerous.
If I could just respond to that, I think the point about dangerousness is a whole nother conversation. I think we can spend all day debating. But again, to the point that there's this data that shows that people who are released somehow end up reoffending at a higher rate, and that has contributed directly to the rise in violence. Is something that we haven't seen, and in fact has been contradicted by reports in the press, including I think it was the Post, which looked at the numbers and showed that there was no connection between that, and in fact it was I believe the reoffending rate for violent cases was about like 1 to 3%. I can't remember the exact number, but it was extremely low, and was not a significant contributor to what has been happening here. What is more realistic is the fact that people are dealing with significant and challenging issues during COVID, and a rise and a really desperation with very little resources that have been available to these communities. And as Julian stated earlier, it's about the defunding of Black and Brown communities for years that has led us to a point where this crisis has disproportionately impacted these communities, and the reactions that are happening now are a reflection of that.
Thank you so much. And I think we are beginning to wrap things up. Mrs. Boston, do you want to step back in?
Ju Hoon Kang, thank you. Dawit Getachew, thank you. Deanna Logan, thank you. Commissioner Benjamin Tucker, thank you. Our moderator, Graeme Raymond, thank you. This was not, let's just say, an easy conversation to have. And so I am so thankful to each and every one of you for your time, for your courage, and for your insights. This is an important conversation. I want to thank my dear Terry Rosenblatt and the Criminal Courts Committee, because you heard my cry. I said, I want to have a panel on this, and you came through for me. Thank you. I am deeply concerned, and I am deeply invested in this issue. I am a Black woman. I am the mother of a Black child, 2 children actually. I am the wife of a retired New York State trooper, and I am the mother of someone currently in police enforcement. This is an important issue, y'all. It is dividing our nation, one of the things, and we must figure out how to resolve all of this. So again, I say to you, I believe this is the bar of hope. We are going to keep having these conversations. To what you just said, that was the last topic was something we could have a whole day on. So we're going to continue these conversations. The City Bar is dedicated to bringing folks together so we can hash this out. Because again, I'm going to end where I started. A change is going to come. We are the bar of hope. It's going to happen. I want to thank everyone who joined us today. Please go out there, be healthy, be safe, and let's have these conversations outside of this forum but let's work together. United we stand, divided we fall, y'all. God bless all of you. Have a wonderful day. And again, peace and love. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Graeme, thank you very much. June,
Thank you, sir.
good to see you. June, DeWitt, it's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Deanna.
Thank you. Hope to continue the conversation with all of you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Take care.